Hello and welcome, everyone, to another exciting and thought-provoking episode here on the English Globe. I'm your host, Adam, and today we're diving deep into one of the most fascinating stories in global history, how the United States of America rose to become the most powerful country in the world. This isn't just about politics or war, it's about economics, culture, technology, and influence. So, get ready for a journey that spans centuries.
And I'm Julia, your co-host. Thank you so much for joining us today. Before we begin, if you're enjoying this type of historical and international analysis, please don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the English Globe, and tap the bell icon so you never miss an episode. Also, tell us in the comments where you're listening from and what your opinion is on today's topic. Do you think the US will stay on top, or is its power declining?
That's right, Julia. We love hearing from all our global listeners, and we always learn a lot from your insights. Now back to the topic. How did a group of rebellious colonies on the edge of the Atlantic transform into the world's most influential superpower? It didn't happen overnight. It took over 2 centuries of strategy, innovation, and sometimes brute force. We'll break this down step by step in this podcast.
We'll begin with the foundations of American power, going back to the late 1700s when the US was just an emerging republic. Then we'll move into the Industrial Age, explore America's involvement in the World Wars, examine the Cold War, and finish with the modern digital era. At each step, we'll explore what allowed the US to rise. Was it its economy, military, geography, or maybe its values and systems?
This story is more than just historical dates and names. It's also about how the American identity, economy, and political system gave the U.S. a unique edge in global affairs. And we'll also be looking at the criticisms and consequences of American power. From cultural dominance to controversial foreign policies, this story is complex, and we're going to present it in a balanced, neutral, and informative way.
Exactly. Whether you're a student of international relations, a history lover, or just curious about the world, this episode will help you understand why America holds such a central place in global politics. And don't worry, even though the topic is deep, we'll keep the language simple and clear so everyone can follow along. That's part of our mission here at the English Globe, making complex global topics easy to understand.
Throughout this podcast, we're also going to compare the United States with other powerful countries like Britain, Germany, Russia, and of course, China. Why did the U.S. succeed where others failed? What role did innovation, immigration, and war play? And how did the American dream, that idea of opportunity and freedom, influence not just Americans but people around the world?
We'll also touch on major moments that shaped U.S. power, like the end of World War II, the fall of the Soviet Union, and the rise of the Internet. But just as important are the invisible forces, such as financial dominance, global trade, and soft power like movies, education, and technology. These are the tools that help the US lead without always needing to fight.
This isn't just a history lesson. It's a story about power and how it moves from one country to another. We'll ask tough questions too. Is American power a force for good in the world? Or has it caused more harm than help? We'll also explore how the world sees the U.S., admired by many, criticized by others, but undeniably at the center of global affairs.
And one more thing before we begin. We really want to hear your thoughts. So after listening, go to the comments section and tell us. Do you believe the US is still the strongest power today? What do you think makes a country truly powerful? Is it the military, money, ideas, or something else? Share your perspective, and let's create a global conversation.
All right. Now let's get started with Section 2, where we'll begin our story right after the American Revolution. We'll explore how a young and fragile republic started building the political, geographic, and economic foundations that would eventually support its rise to global power. From the Constitution to the Civil War, from frontier expansion to early trade, we'll break it all down.
So stay with us. This is going to be a long, rich, and fascinating journey through American history and global politics. Whether you're listening at home on your commute or during your study break, you're part of the English Globe family. Let's begin our exploration of how the US took global power from the ground up.
Let's go back to the late 18th century. In 1776, the 13 American colonies declared independence from Britain, one of the strongest empires at the time. This act wasn't just brave, it was revolutionary. The idea that people could reject a king and rule themselves was new. The American Revolution was both a political and philosophical turning point, but the new nation was weak, divided, and uncertain about its future.
That's right, Adam. The United States in its early years was anything but powerful. The economy was small and mostly agricultural. The government under the Articles of Confederation was too weak to make real decisions. But in 1787, the US adopted a new constitution, creating a stronger federal system. This gave the country more unity and allowed for laws, taxes, and the building of an army. It was a big step toward becoming a real nation-state.
Geography also helped. The United States had a massive stretch of land with rivers, forests, and untapped resources. Even though it was far from Europe, this distance provided protection. Unlike European countries that constantly faced wars on their borders, the U.S. could grow without fear of invasion. The Atlantic Ocean acted like a natural wall. That gave America space and time to build its economy and political structure.
And the population started to grow fast. In 1800, the US had around 5 million people. By 1860, that number had grown to more than 31 million. Most were farmers, but cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia were starting to develop. Immigration from Europe increased as people came looking for land and freedom. This growing labor force would later support America's industrial rise.
One of the biggest turning points came in 1803, the Louisiana Purchase. President Thomas Jefferson bought a huge piece of land from France, doubling the size of the U.S. overnight. This gave the country control over the Mississippi River and opened up vast new lands for farming and settlement. It was a peaceful expansion, and it signaled that the U.S. had big ambitions.
At the same time, the US was developing its economy. Agriculture was still dominant, especially in the South where slavery was used for growing cotton. But in the North, industry and trade were starting to grow. Ships carried American goods to Europe, and factories were beginning to appear in cities. This divide, between a farming South and an industrializing North, would later lead to deep tensions.
And let's not forget the ideology of manifest destiny, the belief that the U.S. had a divine right to expand across the continent. This idea justified wars, forced removals of Native Americans, and new settlements. It wasn't peaceful, and many lives were lost. But it shows how America saw itself as a nation with a mission to grow and lead. That mindset shaped how future leaders thought about power.
The War of 1812 is also worth mentioning. The US fought Britain again, partly over trade and partly to defend its honor. Even though the war ended in a draw, Americans saw it as a victory. It gave them confidence and showed that the young nation could stand up to powerful European empires. After that war, American nationalism grew stronger. People began to believe that their country had a special role to play in the world.
By the 1820s and 1830s, America was building more roads, canals, and railways. These projects connected cities and farms and made trade much easier. They also allowed people to move west more quickly. The Erie Canal, completed in 1825, linked the Great Lakes with the Atlantic Ocean. It helped make New York City a major economic center, a title it still holds today.
But not everything was peaceful during this time. The issue of slavery divided the country deeply. The North was moving toward industry and free labor, while the South remained tied to slavery and plantations. The political system tried to balance these differences, but the tension kept growing. In 1861, those tensions exploded into the American Civil War, the bloodiest conflict in U.S. history.
The Civil War lasted 4 years, from 1861 to 1865. The North wanted to keep the Union together and eventually to end slavery. The South wanted independence and to keep its way of life. In the end, the Union won, slavery was abolished, and the federal government became much stronger. This victory marked a turning point. It showed that the U.S. would remain united, and it proved that federal power was supreme.
Even more important, the war pushed the U.S. closer to becoming a modern industrial nation. The North's victory was powered by its factories, railroads, and larger population. After the war, these strengths would only grow. The U.S. began to shift from being a mostly rural country to an industrial one. That shift would play a major role in its rise to global power in the coming decades.
So by 1865, the U.S. had achieved several key things. It had a strong and stable political system, a growing population, and control of a huge landmass full of resources. It had defeated internal rebellion, and it was starting to build the industries that would one day rival Europe's. But it was still not a global power. That would come in the next phase, during the Industrial Revolution and the Age of Empire.
Exactly. What we see during this foundation period is the preparation. It's like watching the early chapters of a long novel. The pieces are being placed on the board. The US wasn't yet rich, powerful, or globally influential. But the potential was there, and after 1865, things would start to change very fast. That's what we'll explore in the next section. America's rise during the Age of Industry.
So stay with us. In Section 3, we'll cover the period from 1865 to 1914. This was the time of railroads, oil barons, and booming cities. It was also when the U.S. began to think not just about growing at home, but about reaching out to the world. We'll talk about how American capitalism, innovation, and ambition helped it move from regional power to global player. So far, we've covered how the United States laid its foundations, politically, territorially, and socially, up to 1865. Now we enter one of the most powerful and transformational periods in American history, the Industrial Explosion. From 1865 to 1914, the U.S. went from a wounded post-war nation to the world's largest economy. This period changed everything.
Absolutely, Adam. After the Civil War, the US entered a phase of rapid industrialization. The North's factories, transportation networks, and skilled labor had played a big role in winning the war. And now, those tools were turned toward growth. Railroads expanded westward, cities grew upward and outward, and industries like steel, oil, coal, and textiles exploded. The US became an economic machine.
Let's talk about the railroads first. They were more than just transportation. They were the backbone of the new economy. Between 1865 and 1900, the U.S. built over 160,000 kilometers of railway tracks. The most famous project was the Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869. It connected the east and west coasts and made it possible to move goods, people, and military forces faster than ever before.
And with railroads came steel. Steel was needed for tracks, trains, bridges, and buildings. One of the most influential figures in this industry was Andrew Carnegie, a Scottish immigrant who built a steel empire. Carnegie's factories used new technology like the Bessemer process to make steel cheaper and faster. His company would later become part of U.S. Steel, one of the largest corporations in the world.
Next comes oil, and that brings us to another powerful name, John D. Rockefeller. He founded Standard Oil, which at one point controlled over 90% of oil refining in the U.S. Oil was used for lighting, lubrication, and later for engines. Rockefeller's methods of business, cutting costs, buying competitors, and controlling supply, helped define modern capitalism, but they also created controversy and led to calls for regulation.
Yes, and that's when we start hearing the term robber barons. These were the powerful industrialists like Carnegie, Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, and Vanderbilt who built enormous fortunes but were often accused of exploiting workers, crushing competition, and manipulating markets. At the same time, they helped build America's infrastructure and donated large parts of their wealth to universities, libraries, and museums.
As industry grew, so did urbanization. People moved from farms to cities in search of jobs. Immigrants from Europe, especially from Ireland, Italy, Poland, and Germany, flooded into New York, Chicago, Boston, and other industrial hubs. By 1900, over 40% of Americans lived in cities. The U.S. was transforming from a rural to an urban society, and that changed the way people lived, worked, and thought.
With the rise of cities came problems too. Housing was crowded, sanitation was poor, and workers often worked long hours in dangerous factories. But this also led to new movements, like labor unions. Workers began to organize for better pay, shorter hours, and safer conditions. Strikes, protests, and eventually government reforms began to shape the labor system. This showed that power in the US wasn't just economic, it was also political and social.
Technology also played a huge role in America's rise. During this period, inventors like Thomas Edison and Alexander Graham Bell changed daily life. Edison's electric light bulb and Bell's telephone revolutionized communication and productivity. These inventions helped American businesses grow more efficient and helped create entirely new industries. Innovation became a core part of U.S. identity.
By 1900, the US economy had surpassed Britain's to become the largest in the world. This was a massive shift. Britain had dominated the global economy during the 1800s, but America's combination of natural resources, labor, innovation, and capital had created a powerful industrial engine. The US had not yet taken on a global leadership role, but economically, it was already a superpower.
Let's not forget the role of finance in all this. Banks like J.P. Morgan and Co. provided the capital needed to fund railroads, steel mills, and oil pipelines. Wall Street in New York became the financial heart of the country. The New York Stock Exchange grew in importance, and American businesses began to raise massive sums of money by selling shares. This helped fuel expansion at a pace the world had never seen.
American culture was also starting to have an impact. While Europe was still seen as the cultural capital of the world, US cities were becoming centers of music, newspapers, theater, and sports. Baseball, for example, became America's pastime, and immigrants brought their own traditions, creating a diverse cultural mix that would later influence the entire world. This mix became part of the American brand.
And as the U.S. grew internally, it began looking outward. By the late 1800s, America had started to show interest in global influence. It purchased Alaska from Russia in 1867. It sent missionaries and businessmen to Asia, and in 1898, it fought Spain in the Spanish-American War, gaining control of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. For the first time, the U.S. had overseas territories.
The Spanish-American War marked the start of America's global presence. It showed that the US was willing to use military force to protect its interests. At the same time, it sparked debates at home. Should America become an empire? What were its responsibilities in foreign lands? These questions would continue to shape US foreign policy for the next century.
So by 1914, on the eve of World War I, the United States had gone through a dramatic transformation. It had become the largest economy in the world. It had massive industries, powerful banks, and a growing influence overseas. The population had more than tripled since 1860. The country was confident, wealthy, and ambitious. and it was ready to play a bigger role on the world stage.
But it still wasn't fully engaged in global politics. That would come soon. In our next section, we'll explore how the First World War pushed America from a powerful nation into a global actor. We'll talk about how war, diplomacy, and economics pushed the US out of isolation and into leadership. So stay with us. The journey to global power is just heating up.
By 1914, the United States had become an industrial and economic giant, but it still preferred to stay out of European political and military affairs. This approach was known as isolationism, a belief that the U.S. should avoid becoming involved in foreign wars and alliances. Most Americans believed the Atlantic Ocean gave them enough distance to stay safe from global conflicts. But that idea would be tested in the coming years.
When World War I broke out in Europe in 1914, the US government declared neutrality. The war involved powerful empires, Britain, France, and Russia on one side, and Germany, Austria, Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire on the other. Though officially neutral, the US continued to trade heavily with the Allied powers, sending weapons, food, and supplies. American banks also lent large sums of money to the Allies.
This economic support tilted the U.S. closer to the Allies, even though it tried to appear neutral. As the war dragged on, the human cost in Europe became enormous. Trenches, gas attacks, and machine guns led to mass casualties. Meanwhile, the U.S. economy was booming. War orders fueled factories, provided jobs, and strengthened America's role as a global supplier. But staying out of the conflict became harder with each year.
A major turning point came in 1917. Germany had resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, attacking ships in the Atlantic without warning. Several American ships were sunk, and over time, public opinion began to shift. The final blow came with the Zimmermann telegram, in which Germany secretly urged Mexico to attack the US if America entered the war. This message was intercepted and made public, creating outrage across the country.
In April 1917, President Woodrow Wilson asked Congress to declare war on Germany. He said the world must be made safe for democracy. With that, the United States officially entered World War I. This was a massive shift in American foreign policy. For the first time, the U.S. was sending troops to fight in a large-scale European conflict, and it would mark the beginning of America's rise as a global political force.
The American military was not as large or experienced as Europe's armies, but the US made up for that with resources and speed. Within a year, over 2 million American soldiers, known as the American Expeditionary Forces, were sent to Europe. Led by General John J. Pershing, they brought fresh energy and helped push back German advances. The arrival of US troops lifted the morale of the Allied forces.
American industry also played a critical role. Factories shifted to wartime production, making guns, ammunition, vehicles, and uniforms. Farmers increased output to feed both American troops and European allies. The U.S. also launched Liberty Bond campaigns, encouraging citizens to buy government bonds to fund the war. This created a strong link between government, economy, and citizens in national efforts.
On the battlefield, American forces helped turn the tide of the war. In key battles like Château-Thierry, Belleau Wood, and the Meuse-Argonne offensive, US troops played vital roles in breaking German lines. The psychological impact of American strength was just as powerful as their military presence. For many in Europe, the US came to be seen as a new, hopeful force in a war-torn continent.
The war ended in November 1918 with an armistice. Germany surrendered, and the Allied powers declared victory. The human cost was staggering. Over 16 million people died, and much of Europe was left in ruins. Though the U.S. had entered the war late, its contribution was decisive, and now America had a new voice in global diplomacy. President Wilson wanted to lead the effort to rebuild the world and prevent future wars.
Wilson presented his famous 14 points, which outlined his vision for peace, free trade, open diplomacy, and national self-determination. The most important point was the creation of the League of Nations, a global organization meant to resolve conflicts without war. At the Paris Peace Conference, Wilson was treated like a global hero. For the first time, an American president was leading international negotiations.
But things were more complicated back home. While Wilson wanted the U.S. to take an active global role, many Americans still supported isolationism. They feared getting dragged into more foreign wars. When Wilson brought the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations proposal to Congress, it was rejected. The U.S. never joined the League, signaling a return to cautious foreign policy despite its growing influence.
Still, the impact of World War I was clear. The United States had shown that it could project power across oceans. It had become a military player, a diplomatic voice, and the world's top economy. The war gave American businesses access to new markets and global leadership in finance. Wall Street replaced London as the world's financial capital. The US dollar started to gain strength internationally.
By 1920, America's role in the world had permanently changed. Even though it stepped back from global institutions, the U.S. was now seen as a superpower in waiting. It had a powerful economy, a large population, and unmatched industrial capabilities. Its military had proved itself capable. Most importantly, it had become central to global peace talks, trade deals, and rebuilding efforts.
The seeds of American global leadership were now planted. Though the 1920s would bring a wave of isolationism again, the path was already set. America could no longer be just a spectator on the world stage. It had shown that when it entered a global crisis, it could change the outcome. This marked the beginning of what some historians call the American century.
In our next section, we'll explore the years between the two world wars, the Roaring Twenties, the Great Depression, and how the U.S. economy influenced the world even while the government stayed largely neutral. It's a time of cultural expansion, financial growth, and eventual collapse, a chapter that shaped America's next move toward full global power. Now, Julia, as we trace the rise of U.S. global power, we can't skip over the profound impact of the two world wars. These were more than just battles between countries. They were turning points in history, especially for the United States. World War I, for example, marked the first major moment when the U.S. stepped onto the global stage in a military and economic sense. Though it joined the war late, its industrial support and military power turned the tide in favor of the Allies.
Exactly, Adam. And what's fascinating is how the US was able to emerge from World War I in a far better position than the European powers. While countries like Britain, France, and Germany were left with massive destruction, debts, and casualties, the US experienced a huge economic boom. It lent billions of dollars to the Allies during the war and came out as the world's largest creditor. This economic position gave America serious leverage in global affairs.
And that leverage only grew during World War II. The U.S. entered the Second World War after the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. Before that, it had tried to stay neutral, but once it joined, the full force of American industry was mobilized. Factories that once produced cars began making tanks and planes. The war effort created millions of jobs and pulled the country out of the Great Depression. This kind of rapid transformation was unmatched anywhere else in the world.
Right. The US became the arsenal of democracy. And while other major countries were being bombed and reduced to rubble, the American homeland remained untouched. That gave it a major post-war advantage. Europe and Asia had to rebuild from scratch, while the US was able to extend its influence by funding reconstruction, like with the famous Marshall Plan, which provided billions of dollars in aid to help rebuild Western Europe.
The Marshall Plan wasn't just charity, it was strategic. By helping Europe recover, the U.S. made sure those countries didn't fall into chaos or communism, especially as tensions with the Soviet Union began to rise. The U.S. used its economic power to build alliances and shape the post-war world order. It pushed for free market systems, democracy, and open trade, and it backed that vision with money, military bases, and political support.
And don't forget about the institutions the US helped create after World War II. The United Nations was established in 1945 with US leadership. Then came the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which later became the World Trade Organization. These were all tools to organize the world in a way that reflected US values and interests. It was soft power, but extremely effective.
Absolutely. The end of World War II didn't just mean victory over fascism. It meant the U.S. was now firmly the leader of the free world. Its military was the strongest, its economy was booming, and it had both the will and the means to shape global affairs. The Soviet Union was the only serious rival, and that set the stage for the Cold War, a competition that would dominate global politics for decades.
So in this part of the story, we really see how the US transitioned from a relatively isolated power to a global leader. It used war, economics, diplomacy, and ideology to position itself at the center of world affairs. This was the beginning of what many call the American century. It's where the US not only participated in the global order, it became the architect of that order.
And it's also important to note that U.S. power wasn't just about politics and war. American culture, Hollywood, music, fashion, and technology started to spread around the world too. This cultural influence, combined with economic and military strength, made the U.S. a superpower in every sense of the word. The world started to watch what America did, and often followed its lead.
That's such a powerful point, Adam. The wars were brutal, but for the US, they were also defining. The country proved its strength, won trust from its allies, and set up a global system that favored its leadership. As we move to the next section, we'll dive into the Cold War and see how this power was tested, challenged, and ultimately expanded. Stay with us.
As the dust settled after World War II, the United States stood tall among the ruins of Europe and Asia. Its cities were untouched, its economy booming, and its military might unmatched. But to turn wartime dominance into lasting global leadership, the U.S. needed to shape the new world order, and that's exactly what it did at Bretton Woods in 1944. This was more than just an economic conference. It was a power move that reshaped the global financial system and ensured American influence for decades to come.
That's right, Adam. The Bretton Woods Conference, held in New Hampshire, brought together 44 allied nations to design a new international economic system. But it was the US that led the charge. American economists and diplomats came prepared with detailed plans. The British, weakened by war and burdened by debt, had limited leverage. The result? The birth of institutions like the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank, both headquartered in Washington, D.C., and heavily influenced by U.S. policy and funding.
Exactly, Julia. Under this new system, the U.S. dollar became the anchor of international trade, pegged to gold, while other currencies were tied to the dollar. This arrangement gave the U.S. enormous power. If countries wanted to trade or stabilize their economies, they needed access to dollars. And who controlled the dollars? The Federal Reserve in Washington. It was a brilliant strategy. Without firing a shot, the U.S. made its currency the central gear of the global economic machine.
Let's break that down even more. Countries recovering from war needed loans to rebuild infrastructure, develop industries, and stabilize their currencies. The World Bank, funded largely by the US, became the primary lender. The IMF helped countries with balance of payments issues, also using funds supplied mainly by the US. So every financial lifeline carried an American signature. And because the dollar was the reserve currency, the US could print more of it without facing the same inflationary risks as other countries.
And that global trust in the dollar allowed the U.S. to run budget deficits and trade deficits without much consequence. If another country did the same, it would spark a crisis. But not the US. Why? Because the world needed dollars. It was a cycle that fed itself. The more the world relied on the dollar, the more power the US had to influence economies. The Bretton Woods system turned economic interdependence into a platform for global leadership. And behind it all, American policymakers pulled the strings.
The genius of this system wasn't just the currency, it was the institutions. The World Bank focused on long-term development, especially in poorer countries. The IMF offered short-term support to stabilize currencies. Both organizations required member states to follow economic policies approved by American-led boards. If a country wanted help, it had to align with the US vision of capitalism, market reforms, and integration into the global trade system. It was soft power deployed at scale.
And let's not forget about the Marshall Plan. While not technically part of Bretton Woods, it was closely related. Between 1948 and 1952, the U.S. gave over $12 billion in aid to help rebuild Europe. But this aid wasn't charity, it was strategic. By rebuilding Western Europe, the U.S. created strong allies, opened new markets for American goods, and created a bulwark against communism. The plan accelerated recovery and locked Western Europe into a system of economic and political alignment with Washington.
Many countries gladly accepted this arrangement. For them, US leadership offered stability, investment, and growth. But it wasn't without critics. Some nations, especially in the global South, began to see these institutions as tools of American dominance. Loans came with strings attached. Structural adjustment programs often demanded privatization, deregulation, and reduced public spending. While these policies helped some economies, others fell into deeper debt and inequality. The US shaped the system, but not always for everyone's benefit.
That's a key point. The post-war economic order worked beautifully for the US and its allies. American companies gained access to global markets. American investors had new opportunities. American culture and consumerism spread along with American dollars. From Hollywood films to Coca-Cola, the U.S. exported its way of life alongside its economic system. And because the U.S. controlled the institutions that governed international trade and finance, it could set the rules that others had to follow.
This economic system, underpinned by Bretton Woods and American-led institutions, laid the foundation for globalization. Trade barriers came down. Multinational corporations expanded. Capital moved freely across borders. And at the center of it all, the United States. Its economy, its currency, and its corporations became the pillars of the global economy. And with that came enormous geopolitical influence. When a country depended on US loans, trade deals, or military protection, it often aligned its foreign policy accordingly.
Of course, this dominance wasn't entirely smooth. By the late 1960s and early 70s, strains began to show. U.S. inflation rose, trade deficits grew, and countries started doubting the dollar's fixed link to gold. This led to the collapse of the Bretton Woods system in 1971, when President Nixon ended the dollar's convertibility to gold. But by then, the U.S. dollar had already taken on a life of its own. Even without the gold backing, it remained the global reserve currency, simply because there was no alternative.
And the institutions survived. The IMF and World Bank adapted to new realities. They continued to serve as gatekeepers of global finance, often reinforcing US interests. Meanwhile, the US dollar dominated oil trade, international finance, and foreign reserves. New powers emerged: Japan, the European Union, China, but none could displace the dollar or the institutions built after WSN. That's the lasting power of Bretton Woods. It didn't just manage a post-war recovery, it created an enduring architecture for US economic leadership.
So when we talk about how the US took global power, we can't ignore this moment. Military strength mattered. Political alliances mattered. But economic architecture was the real foundation. The Bretton Woods system allowed the U.S. to turn victory into leadership. It made American influence structural. It wasn't just about what the U.S. did, it was about how the system itself favored U.S. dominance. And even today, decades later, that influence is still very much alive.
Absolutely, Adam. The US didn't just win a war, it designed a world. And by leading the post-war reconstruction and building the global economic order in its own image, it ensured that the balance of power tilted westward for generations. That's what made the 20th century the American century. And in the next section, we'll explore how the Cold War helped reinforce that dominance through a global ideological battle that further cemented America's global role. Stay tuned.
Following the end of World War II, the United States faced a new and complex challenge: the rise of the Soviet Union as a global rival. This rivalry sparked the Cold War, a conflict unlike any before. It was not a direct military confrontation, but a competition for influence across the world. The U.S. adopted a strategy of containment, aiming to stop the spread of communism and Soviet power through alliances, economic aid, and sometimes military intervention.
Right, Adam. The Cold War shaped nearly every aspect of US foreign and domestic policy for more than 4 decades. It was a battle of ideologies: capitalism and democracy versus communism and authoritarianism. This ideological conflict extended from Europe to Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The US sought to build a network of allies and bases worldwide, supporting friendly governments and opposing Soviet-backed regimes. It was a global chess game with high stakes.
One of the earliest and most important moves was the Marshall Plan, which we touched on before. Beyond rebuilding Europe's economies, it aimed to create stable, prosperous states that would resist communist influence. Simultaneously, the U.S. helped establish NATO in 1949, a military alliance that committed the U.S. and Western European countries to collective defense. This was a clear signal that America was committed to European security and prepared to confront Soviet threats.
Meanwhile, in Asia, the US faced significant challenges. The Chinese Civil War ended in 1949 with the Communist Party taking control of mainland China. This was a major setback for US strategy and marked the beginning of an intense rivalry in Asia. Then, the Korean War, 1950-1953, broke out when North Korea, supported by China and the Soviet Union, invaded South Korea. The US led a United Nations coalition to defend the South, demonstrating its willingness to fight to contain communism.
The Cold War was marked by intense military buildup and technological competition. The U.S. developed a powerful nuclear arsenal as a deterrent against Soviet aggression. This period, known as Mutually Assured Destruction, MAD, meant that both sides understood that full-scale nuclear war would be catastrophic. But it also fueled arms races, espionage, and proxy wars. The U.S. engaged in covert operations, supporting anti-communist groups around the globe.
Latin America was another focus of US efforts. Fearful of Soviet influence spreading, the US backed various governments and regimes, sometimes authoritarian, to maintain control and stability. The 1961 Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba and the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 brought the world dangerously close to nuclear war. These crises showed how global the Cold War had become, with the US and Soviet Union willing to risk everything to maintain dominance.
The space race also became a key arena of Cold War rivalry. After the Soviet Union launched Sputnik in 1957, the first artificial satellite, the U.S. accelerated its own space program. The eventual American moon landing in 1969 was not only a technological triumph, but also a symbolic victory in the ideological battle. The ability to lead in science and technology reinforced U.S. claims of superiority and global leadership.
Throughout this period, US foreign policy was influenced by the doctrine of containment, championed by diplomat George Kennan. It prioritized preventing Soviet expansion through political, economic, and military means, often supporting regimes and movements that aligned with US interests, regardless of their democratic credentials. This sometimes led to controversial interventions in countries like Vietnam, which became a long and divisive conflict.
The Vietnam War exposed limits to American power and changed perceptions both at home and abroad. It raised questions about intervention, costs of war, and the complexities of fighting proxy battles in foreign lands. Despite military strength, the U.S. faced fierce resistance and eventually withdrew in 1973. This war left a lasting impact on U.S. foreign policy, leading to more cautious engagement in global conflicts.
In parallel, the US economy continued to grow, driven by technology, consumerism, and military spending. American corporations expanded globally, and cultural exports like music, movies, and fashion became symbols of soft power. The Cold War was fought not just with weapons but also with ideas, culture, and economics. The United States positioned itself as the leader of the free world, a champion of progress and democracy.
By the 1980s, the Cold War entered a new phase under President Ronald Reagan, who increased defense spending and pushed a strong anti-communist agenda. Reagan's policies, combined with internal pressures in the Soviet Union, including economic stagnation and political reforms under Mikhail Gorbachev, led to the eventual end of the Cold War. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 symbolized the collapse of communist power in Eastern Europe.
The Cold War officially ended in 1991 with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. This was a historic moment, marking the United States as the sole superpower. For the first time in decades, there was no serious ideological rival challenging American dominance. The US emerged not only militarily and economically powerful, but also politically and culturally dominant. The world had entered a new era, one shaped largely by American leadership.
This period set the stage for America's role in the 21st century. The institutions, alliances, and economic systems built during the Cold War continued to function. The U.S. remained a global policeman, intervening in conflicts and promoting its values. At the same time, challenges from emerging powers, regional conflicts, and global issues like terrorism and climate change began to test America's influence in new ways.
So when we look back at the Cold War era, we see it as the time when the US truly cemented its global power status. It was a period of competition, conflict, and cooperation. But above all, it was a period when American strategy, economy, culture, and military strength combined to shape the modern world. The legacy of the Cold War continues to influence international relations today.
In the next section, we'll explore America's role in the post-Cold War world, how it adapted to new global challenges, faced new competitors, and maintained its leadership through the early 21st century. The story of American power is ongoing, and understanding this history helps us make sense of today's complex world. With the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the United States emerged as the world's sole superpower. For the first time in modern history, there was no major rival challenging American global dominance. This moment seemed to signal an era of unprecedented peace and prosperity under U.S. leadership. But as we now know, the post-Cold War period introduced a complex set of new challenges that tested American power in many unexpected ways.
Indeed, Adam. The 1990s began with a sense of optimism. The US led efforts to expand democracy, open markets, and promote globalization. Institutions like the United Nations, NATO, and the World Trade Organization gained new roles in shaping the world. America helped mediate conflicts, led peacekeeping missions, and supported economic development around the globe. The idea of a new world order, championed by President George H.W. Bush, promised cooperation and stability.
However, the post-Cold War world was far from stable. Conflicts erupted in the Balkans with the breakup of Yugoslavia, leading to brutal wars and humanitarian crises. The U.S. intervened through NATO to halt ethnic cleansing and restore peace, marking a shift towards multilateral military engagements beyond the Cold War context. These interventions raised questions about America's responsibilities as the global policeman and the limits of military power.
The 1990s also saw the rise of globalization as a dominant economic force. American companies expanded worldwide, technology transformed industries, and communication connected people like never before. But globalization brought winners and losers. While many countries experienced rapid growth and poverty reduction, inequality increased within nations. Trade agreements, often led by the US, sparked debates about job losses and cultural changes, leading to political backlash in some regions.
Another major challenge emerged with the rise of non-state actors and terrorism. The 1993 World Trade Center bombing and later the 1998 U.S. Embassy bombings in Africa signaled a new kind of threat. But nothing compared to the events of September 11, 2001. The terrorist attacks shocked the nation and the world. They fundamentally changed U.S. foreign policy, leading to the global war on terror, wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and new debates about security, liberty, and global intervention.
The wars that followed were complex and controversial. The US toppled the Taliban in Afghanistan and Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq. But both conflicts became long, costly, and difficult to resolve. Insurgencies, sectarian violence, and political instability persisted. These wars tested American military and political will and raised questions about nation-building and interventionism. The post-9/11 era reshaped perceptions of American power at home and abroad.
Economically, the early 2000s also saw the United States face new realities. The 2008 global financial crisis, triggered by risky banking practices and housing market collapse, caused a severe recession. The crisis had worldwide impacts and damaged confidence in American financial leadership. While the U.S. economy recovered, it exposed vulnerabilities and sparked debates about regulation, inequality, and the sustainability of American economic dominance.
Meanwhile, other powers began to rise. China's rapid economic growth, military modernization, and expanding diplomatic reach introduced a new competitor on the global stage. The US responded with strategies like the pivot to Asia, aiming to strengthen alliances and maintain influence in the Indo-Pacific region. The growing rivalry between the US and China represents one of the most significant challenges to American global leadership since the Cold War.
In addition, global issues such as climate change, pandemics, and cyber threats have complicated the international environment. These challenges require cooperation beyond traditional power politics. The U.S. has taken leadership roles in some areas, but has also faced criticism and pushback for unilateral actions or retreat from global agreements. Navigating these issues demands new strategies and alliances.
Culturally and technologically, the US continues to exert significant influence. American tech giants shape global communication and commerce. Hollywood, music, and social media spread American culture worldwide. Yet, questions about data privacy, misinformation, and digital sovereignty challenge traditional notions of power. Soft power remains vital, but it operates in a rapidly changing and contested environment.
So, the post-Cold War era shows us a more complicated picture of American power. While the U.S. remains a central actor in global politics, economics, and culture, its dominance is no longer uncontested or absolute. It faces new competitors, complex challenges, and evolving global dynamics. Understanding this era helps us appreciate the ongoing story of how America adapts to maintain its role in a changing world.
Looking ahead, the question remains: how will the US respond to these new challenges? Will it continue to lead through alliances, innovation, and diplomacy? Or will it retreat from its global role? The answers will shape the future of international relations and the global order. In our next section, we'll explore America's strategies in the 21st century and how it navigates this uncertain and multipolar world.
As we enter the 21st century, the United States faces a complex and evolving global landscape. America remains a powerful nation, economically, militarily, and culturally. But the challenges it confronts are both old and new. From emerging competitors like China to non-traditional threats such as cyber attacks and climate change, U.S. leadership must adapt to remain relevant and effective on the world stage.
That's true, Adam. The post-9/11 era reshaped U.S. foreign policy priorities, focusing heavily on counterterrorism and security. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq tested American military strength and public support. Yet, as those conflicts wind down, attention has shifted toward new strategic competitions, particularly with China and Russia. This competition isn't only military, it's economic, technological, and ideological.
China's rise is perhaps the most significant geopolitical challenge. Its rapid economic growth, massive infrastructure projects like the Belt and Road Initiative, and assertive military posture in the South China Sea have made it a key rival. The U.S. has responded with efforts to strengthen alliances in the Indo-Pacific region, increased military presence, and trade policies aimed at balancing China's influence.
At the same time, Russia remains a potent force, especially through its actions in Eastern Europe and cyber capabilities. Its annexation of Crimea in 2014 and involvement in conflicts like Ukraine have challenged the post-Cold War European security order. The US and NATO have responded with sanctions and increased support to Eastern European allies, signaling ongoing tensions in the region.
But beyond state actors, new challenges have emerged. Cybersecurity threats have escalated, with attacks on infrastructure, elections, and businesses becoming more common and sophisticated. These threats blur the lines between war and peace, requiring new forms of defense and international cooperation. The U.S. is investing heavily in cyber capabilities, but faces difficulties in attribution and response.
Climate change is another global issue that affects security, economics, and diplomacy. The US has had a complicated relationship with international climate agreements, but increasingly recognizes the need to lead on this front. Climate-related disasters, resource shortages, and migration can fuel instability worldwide, making environmental policy a critical component of national security.
Economically, the United States remains the world's largest economy, but faces growing competition. Technology companies based in the U.S. dominate globally, driving innovation in AI, software, and biotechnology. However, concerns over income inequality, infrastructure, and workforce development challenge domestic strength. Economic resilience and innovation are vital to maintaining global leadership.
Culturally, American influence remains strong through media, entertainment, and technology platforms. Yet, the rise of social media has also brought challenges like misinformation, political polarization, and cultural clashes. Soft power is more complicated in a digital age where narratives can be fragmented and contested. Maintaining cultural leadership requires new strategies and adaptability.
In terms of military strategy, the U.S. is focusing on modernization and alliances. It invests in advanced technologies like drones, hypersonic weapons, and space capabilities. Partnerships with NATO, Japan, South Korea, and Australia remain pillars of its security approach. But the prospect of conflicts ranging from conventional warfare to cyber and hybrid tactics demands flexibility and innovation.
Diplomatically, the US balances competition and cooperation. It engages with allies on trade, security, and global challenges, but also faces tensions within international institutions. Multilateralism is under pressure from nationalist movements and shifting priorities. The US must navigate this environment carefully to uphold global stability and its own interests.
In summary, America in the 21st century is a story of adaptation and resilience. Its historic strengths in economy, military, and culture remain, but the environment is more complex and contested than ever. How the U.S. manages relations with rising powers, addresses global challenges, and reforms domestic policies will shape the future of its global leadership.
As we conclude this section, it's clear that the journey of American global power is ongoing. The challenges are formidable, but so is America's capacity for innovation and leadership. In our final section, we'll reflect on the lessons from this long history and consider what the future might hold for the United States on the world stage.
After exploring over a century of history, it's clear that the rise of the United States to global power was not accidental. It was shaped by a combination of economic strength, military might, political vision, and cultural influence. From its early isolation to world wars, the Cold War, and today's complex global environment, America has adapted repeatedly to changing circumstances. This adaptability is key to its enduring influence.
Absolutely, Adam. The US built institutions, forged alliances, and created economic systems that expanded its reach. It faced setbacks and challenges, wars, domestic debates, rising rivals, but consistently sought to lead. That leadership often came with controversy and contradictions, especially when ideals clashed with interests. Yet, the story of American power is also one of innovation, resilience, and ambition.
One major lesson from this history is the importance of both hard and soft power. Military strength alone isn't enough. Economic leadership, cultural influence, and diplomatic engagement are equally vital. The U.S. understood this balance early on, especially after World War II, when it combined military alliances with economic institutions and cultural exports. This comprehensive approach allowed it to shape the world order effectively.
Another lesson is the significance of alliances and partnerships. Whether through NATO, the United Nations, or bilateral agreements, America rarely acts alone. Its power is amplified by coalitions and global networks. But these alliances require care and attention, adapting to new realities and shared interests. The future of US global leadership depends in large part on maintaining strong, flexible partnerships.
Looking to the future, the United States faces both opportunities and risks. Emerging powers like China challenge the unipolar moment, while technological and environmental changes demand new strategies. Domestic issues, political division, economic inequality, and social challenges also influence how America projects power abroad. The global stage is more multipolar and interconnected than ever.
That said, America's foundations remain strong. Its economy is innovative, its military technologically advanced, and its culture influential worldwide. The ability to attract talent, invest in education and research, and lead in new industries will be crucial. Equally important is the commitment to democratic values and human rights, which continue to inspire allies and partners around the world.
As the 21st century unfolds, American leadership will likely be more collaborative and less unilateral. Navigating complex global problems, climate change, pandemics, cyber threats, requires cooperation with diverse actors, including other great powers, international organizations, and even non-state groups. This shift doesn't diminish U.S. power, but transforms how it is exercised.
So the question isn't just how the US took global power, but how it will sustain and adapt that power in the future. History teaches us that no power is permanent. It requires continuous effort, vision, and renewal. The American story is still being written, shaped by choices made by its leaders and citizens in an ever-changing world.
Before we end, we'd like to invite our listeners to reflect on this journey. What do you think are America's greatest strengths and biggest challenges today? How do you see the future of global power evolving? Please share your thoughts in the comments. And if you found this podcast insightful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with others who want to understand this important story.
Thank you so much for joining us on the English Globe. It's been a pleasure to explore this fascinating history with you. Stay curious, keep learning, and we'll see you in our next podcast. Until then, take care and stay safe.